What if you could talk to a death row convict that spent 40 years in the notorious prison of San Quentin? A killer who lived for years with some of the most famous serial killers of all time. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, the Toolbox Killers. William Bonin, the Freeway Killer. Rodney Alcala, the Dating Game Killer. And what if I told you the murderer you will talk to is one of the brightest and most perceptive people you'll ever meet? Someone whose art has been showed in galleries in Paris and London, who has written books and screenplays, who has used his knowledge of serial killers to help police solve cold cases. Bill Noguera has been in prison since he was 18, 40 years, a decade before the rise of the online world. Yet he'd be comfortable in any corporate boardroom. Despite being stuck in a 4 by 9 foot cell most of his life as the world outside changed so dramatically, and even without access to the internet, Bill somehow has a very complete sense of modern life. What does he dream of doing if he ever gets out? Hunting serial killers. And he figures no one, including trained FBI profilers, will be better equipped to do this. In this way, you might see him as the real Hannibal Lecter. In the near future, we will do live shows where you get to ask questions directly to Bill. In the meantime, we'll be posting a series of interviews where he talks about the killers he has lived with, spent time getting to know, finding out what makes them tick. He'll share the intimate details that no FBI profiler ever could learn and give us insights on how to catch these monsters. You'll hear what prison sounds like. While we try to do these interviews in the morning when things are the most calm there, it's never really quiet. Prisoners are issued cell phones, and during calling hours, they can make unlimited calls, though each call is limited to 15 minutes. He has a roommate that's terrified to leave the cell, so in order to have some privacy for our call, he's forced to find a relatively quiet spot outside the cell. You can feel the intensity. Having survived 40 years in this Darwinian environment, Bill listens intently and wastes no words, all the while being sharply aware of everything going on around him. 6'2", 240-pound black belt, he's avoided joining any gangs and therefore is always a target. He's been shanked more than once. So being hyper alert is essential. For our first interview, we'll discuss the notorious Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. You've heard the saying, the exception that proves the rule. That might apply to Richard Ramirez. If ever a serial killer was made and not born, this guy might be it. Born in El Paso, Texas in 1960, the youngest of 5 children, his father was an abusive alcoholic prone to fits of anger. As an early teen, Richard escaped his father's wrath by sometimes sleeping in the cemetery. By the time Richard was 6, he'd been knocked unconscious multiple times, likely impacting his brain's development. At the age of 12, he fell under the wing of his older cousin, Miguel, a decorated Green Beret who committed serial rape and murder in Vietnam during the war. He boasted of these crimes to Richard and showed him Polaroids of women he'd raped, murdered, dismembered, and decapitated. Miguel schooled young Richard in the military tactics of stealth and killing. In 1973, when Richard was only 13, he watched Miguel shoot his wife in the face, killing her. None of this bothered Richard, whose brain was incapable by this point of feeling empathy or shock. Miguel was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and after being confined to an asylum for several years, he was again on the streets. So by this time, Richard seemed unavoidably on the path to becoming the monster he ultimately did. But as if the hands of fate wanted to be sure, it provided another twist. After Miguel shot his wife, Richard was sent to move in with his sister, whose husband, Roberto, was a peeping Tom that took Richard on his nocturnal adventures. Young Richard was already stalking the night, actually being mentored in it.
Imagine if the FBI could put a profiler on death row for 40 years to study killers. In California, no less, where some of the most famous serial killers have been housed. Imagine further that this profiler had an extraordinarily brilliant mind. This is part of a series of interviews with Bill Noguera, a convicted killer who's been on death row 40 years. We'll talk about his first-hand experiences with these killers, how he got to know them, and he'll share with us the many general insights he's developed into the minds of these killers. Insights he has used to help law enforcement hunt them. Today we'll discuss Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Hey, Bill, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing real well. Thank you, Kevin.
Good to hear from you. I've had a lot of conversations with Bill, and you guys are going to find that the perceptions that he's developed with his mind as he's applied to these killers is just really, really insightful, and it gives a perspective that you're not going to get from an FBI profiler. So, Bill, let's talk about Richard Ramirez. Let's begin with your personal experience. The first time you met Ramirez in prison.
Well, that was a very long time ago. I was a very young, impulsive guy who already had spent a number of years in prison because of the crime I had committed as an 18-year-old boy. Prior to this, I was one of the Hapkido middleweight champions, a martial arts champion, and I had several titles. And so I had been observing people, predators, for years. One of my first subjects was my own father. I had to pay attention to his behavior cues in order to survive, basically, from not being physically abused. So Richard Ramirez came into the picture several years later, just after my sentencing, and I was sentenced to death. And the interaction didn't go well for him. At that time, I was considered a convict, and he was considered an inmate. Part of the convict code is if you see a serial killer, a rapist, child predator, you try and kill them as fast as you can. And I followed through with that exact mythology, ideology, rules of engagement for prison and convicts. And as I mentioned, I was in a holding cage waiting to be taken to San Quentin's death row when one of the guards put him in the same cage as me, and I did not hesitate. Richard Ramirez looked at me, he kind of grinned, said something I didn't really understand, and, well, in blatant terms, I assaulted him extremely quickly and brutally, not knocking him out. And the guards separated us, and, well, I did what prison rules required me to do at that time, but it was the very first, but not the last, interaction I had with Richard the Night Stalker Ramirez.
How long had you been on death row when you had this first encounter with him?
Well, I was on my way to death row. I had not been on death row yet. I had just been sentenced to death. So I was still in the holding cages in the courthouse waiting to be flown to San Quentin. At that time, young, aggressive men were flown to San Quentin's death row, and I was awaiting that 10-day period from the time a judge sentences you to death to you being flown to San Quentin State Prison.
So was part of this kind of a way of just establishing in prison that your own identity, that you're not going to be a victim?
Well, in a way, by this time I was already considered a convict, and I had to perform many feats of, violence in order to establish yourself. Otherwise, you become victim. I was placed in a very highly volatile, violent, and brutal world of the Mexican mafia, gang members, and because I was young, I was thrown into that situation because of the incident that happened dealing with violence prior to that. So yes, part of that is to establish yourself. Part of that is to let people know that you are not a victim, but you are more predator than anything else.
So this didn't happen at San Quentin, but then later you were housed at San Quentin with Richard.
That's exactly right.
And so what were your experiences like at San Quentin with him? Did you have more contact with him or any conversations or?
Well, that's interesting you say that because Richard Ramirez finally arrived at San Quentin. He began to believe his own hype. And what I mean by that is that Richard Ramirez, although a violent serial rapist, killer, and child molester, he was also a myth of the media. They made him into a rock star. They played into the fact that he took good pictures from certain angles. So the media really played to that, and he had a big following of women that would chase him around, these groupies. So when he got there, he kind of believed this hype that he was kind of a rock star and everybody was going to love him, or at least worship the ground he lived on or walked on. What he didn't understand was San Quentin's death row is a level 5 prison where the worst and most brutal killers live. He went out to a normal yard, breaking every rule because serial killers are always placed in protective custody. As I mentioned before, the convict code dictates that anybody that has rapes, child molestation, or is a serial killer, or has killed a child, they are to be killed immediately. So he walked out to a regular yard, and exactly what was supposed to happen happened. He was stabbed immediately. And the guy who was stabbing him was a very young guy, didn't know how to kill him, so Richard Ramirez survived that.
So he was obviously surprised. He didn't understand the code then himself, or did he overestimate his own ability to defend himself when he went out?
He just believed in his hype that if he was considered a predator, a dangerous predator, that people on death row would somehow respect that, or at least be afraid of him. And that is, there's nothing further from the truth. In prison, a convict doesn't believe, nor does he respect what you do on the streets. That has nothing to do with who you are in prison. Your reputation is based on your ability to come closer to the ultimate goal, which is to kill another prisoner in prison. The most respected men in prison are those who kill other convicts in prison. He didn't understand that.
So after this, did he avoid the yard? Did he pretty much stick to his cell, or what was his life like?
Well, actually, he still believed in that myth that had been given to him by the media, the Night Stalker. And by the way, that is not an original name. The original Night Stalker was D'Angelo, who is now known as the Golden State Killer. He was the first guy that got the moniker Night Stalker. Obviously, years later, because he was never caught, Richard Ramirez was given that handle. So he believed in it. And he told the officers that it was a mistake, that they had mistaken him for somebody else, and that's why they stabbed him. Well, the truth was that people told him that purposely to try and get him out there again so they can kill him. And the guy actually went back outside, and they stabbed him again. And from that point on, he never came out again. Richard Ramirez spent over 2 decades in cell 4, the 4th tier, 110, and he never came out of that cell unless he was going to a visit, to the shower, or to medical. And I know this because I lived on the same tier with him for over 20 years.
So when he's in this cell there, what's his life like? Are people taunting him, or is he just pretty much ignored?
Well, he had people that he would deal with. One of the persons that he dealt with a lot with was with Lawrence Bittaker, the toolbox killer. Lawrence Bittaker and Richard Ramirez had kind of a small business they ran of pornography. They sold pornography to other perverts and other weirdos, guys in that genre. And most people who were gang affiliated or convicts wouldn't even talk to him.
How do they get that material into the prison?
Well, at that time, pornography was allowed in prison. You can just basically send for it, and it'd be sent out to you.
So, like, they have a VCR or a DVD player. How's that work?
No, it's magazines. It's triple X pornography magazines. And he told them. But the thing about Richard Ramirez, he had a thing about cutting the eyes out of all his magazines. So if you got a magazine from him, the women's eyes were cut out. He always did this. And people knew that if you bought a magazine from him, that was part of the thing with him. And the rest of his life was basically spent in that cell. He didn't come out. It's a very small cell. It's a 4.5 feet. I'm 6'1", so if I touch my elbow to one wall of my cell and I extend my other arm, I can touch the other wall. And the cell's about 9.5 feet deep and about 8 feet tall, so I could touch the ceiling standing on my 2 feet.
So that's really interesting, and we're gonna get so we're gonna get cut off in a second. So we'll just do that, just so people understand. Bill is allowed to do his calls are only allowed to be 15 minutes. So he'll call back, and then we'll edit these together. Okay, so Bill, why don't you just give me a call right back?
Having been using marijuana since he was 12, by the age of 14, he began using LSD regularly and drinking heavily. When Richard was 17, Miguel was released from the asylum, and the two began drinking together. Now, the camel's back had long been broken by the straw in the life of Ramirez by this time, but things cemented when he and his cousin Miguel converted to Satanism and began exploring the occult. As his sexual fantasies developed during adolescence, they centered on graphic violence against women, bondage, mutilation, rape, and murder. His first job involved cleaning rooms at a Holiday Inn, and he would use his key to spy on sleeping patrons. On at least one occasion, he molested children on the inn's elevator, but was not prosecuted. This Holiday Inn job came to an end when he tried to rape a woman in a room, but was caught and beat up by her husband, although the charges were eventually dropped here too because the couple moved to another state. In 1982, at the age of 22, he moved to California. There, he became a burglar and developed a cocaine habit, drifting between LA and San Francisco. Wasn't long before he began to include rape and murder into his burglary routine. His murder spree ran a little more than a year, eventually leading to headlines about the Night Stalker, which he followed with pride. Having matched a fingerprint, the police ran his mugshot in the papers, and it was quickly becoming impossible for him to hide. In August of 1985, Richard was finally captured and beat up by a group of citizens after an attempted carjacking, and his reign of terror came to an end.
Bill, I'm really interested in this, when you were talking about Richard cutting the eyes out, and knowing how many insights you've developed into the minds of these killers, in particular serial killers, over the 40 years you've been there. Do you draw any insights from that particular thing, and have you seen it before with any other killers?
Well, actually, I have. Richard Ramirez is a very rare killer. Not because he's famous, not because of actually his deeds, but because of his psychology. Richard Ramirez is a mixed bag of tricks. He's a serial killer that has an MO, has a signature, but he's able to flip in and out of that signature on what he likes and what he doesn't like. His main, if you want to call it, what makes him special is his ability to sexualize control. And let me explain that. So we distinguish serial killers because they are not just a person who, well, let's take myself, for example. So I was convicted of killing someone, and the charge against me was financial gain. So I'm not saying that this is right because I have actually admitted and accepted responsibility for my crimes, but you can understand where a person would rob a bank and he takes and kills, and he kills somebody because they saw him, they were a witness, or they were killing somebody because of money. It's a logical way of looking at a necessity or a reasoning behind it. Richard Ramirez, like most serial killers, their reasoning is not money, although he did mix burglary and stealing with his crimes. He, like most serial killers, are able to gratify or receive gratification from the act of murder. He takes it to a different level because control is something that he then sexualizes. It's part of him raping, sodomizing, and doing the things that he does, but he's able to also sexualize the control aspect of what he does. Let me explain. He obviously went at homes. He normally shot the husband first with 22 caliber or 25 caliber, and then he had control of the situation. He would then proceed to, tie the woman, handcuff her, somehow immobilize her, and then he would go to raping. It's part of the control factor. He instills fear first. That's part of control. The rape aspect is a violent crime. Rape is not about sex. It's not about love. It's about brutality. It's about control. It's about fear. And this whole time that he's doing this, he's receiving a special type of gratification that's unique to serial killers. This is so because their brains are wired differently than most people.
Yeah, that's everything that I have found is the same thing. So let's, one of the things that you and I have talked about is how serial killers are born and are not made. And I'm wondering, looking at the history of Richard Ramirez growing up and everything he went through, could this be the exception that proves the rule, in a sense? Do you know, are you aware of his background at all?
Yeah, I'm perfectly aware of it. As I said, I studied Richard Ramirez and every serial killer that you can think of, and I've met more serial killers and had relationships with them based on me fooling them into talking to me over the past 40 years than anybody in history.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
So I know exactly what you mean. So my theory, my thesis, and the primitive fact that I have actually written research on this particular subject is that serial killers are actually born this way. Now, I know the so-called experts will sit on platforms and tell you how the abuse that they received is what made them. That is absolutely incorrect, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll tell you why. Richard Ramirez, yes, he's a classic case where you can say, look, his uncle was a murderer, his uncle was a rapist, he showed Richard Ramirez these things, and Richard Ramirez basically was trained to become a killer, and he then went on to become the Night Stalker. It's a good argument, but absolutely untrue. Richard Ramirez was born with a certain outlook in life. His brain was wired a certain way. It's why he killed and continued to kill, and you see an aspect of his murder spree that he began to increase. Because like a drug addict, he began to chase that rush. When serial killers kill, they get a rush. He began to experience that rush, and he kept chasing it. That is not something that you nor I, who has been convicted of crime of murder, do. Died and killed since then, because it doesn't give me gratification. He is able to receive gratification. So if people in fact abuse, trains them, and makes them into killers, well, ladies and gentlemen, we would have millions of serial killers in the world, and we do not. Because there is, unfortunately, millions of kids are both physically, emotionally, and physically abused every day. And we don't have that many serial killers. We have approximately between 40 and 60 serial killers working at one time in the world. About the same number of children that are born every year that have this ability to do things that have never been taught. For example, a child who picks up a piano and begins to play the piano at a concert level at the age of 4. A child who's able to do trigonometry, calculus, motion physics at the age of 5. These kids were born with a different type of outlook, a different type of brain. That's why serial killers do what they do. They're born that way. Now, I'm not ignorant that abuse does tweak them a little bit. Their signature, the way they kill, the type of people they kill may be influenced by experiences in their life. For example, their mother wore red shoes when she abused them, and they killed people with red shoes. That's the symptom. The action of killing, the act of killing, was already in them.
Let's talk about Richard's first kill, because I think a lot of times we can get a lot of insights from a serial killer, from his first kill, or maybe any incidents where he almost killed but didn't. Or I'm not sure if that applies here, but talk about his first kills, his first experiences.
Well, we from law enforcement, we pick up in Richard's life when he's already the Night Stalker. He's killing quickly, and brutally. He's driving around, he's burglarizing houses, and he's killing. That is actually not his first kill. And we learn that years later when we find a young San Francisco child in an apartment complex that had been raped and murdered. That was Richard Ramirez. But no one talks about those murders, because prior to Richard Ramirez being a serial killer, he was a serial pedophile. He raped children. That's why I said that he's very unique. He has different parts of himself that are almost compartmentalized. And it's rare. You don't see a person who's a pedophile then become a guy who rapes women and a guy who gets involved in other sexual traits.
Right.
With him, that's very unique to him.
And I think it's not, but I think it's also consistent too, because some of the other killers that I've looked at, say for instance the Boston Strangler, and I think even Ramirez here too, they start out with children, but also the elderly, because they're the easiest targets. So they may not be a classic pedophile in the sense that he's attracted to children so much as those are the easier targets. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. An opportunity arises and they take it. And remember I mentioned earlier that he could sexualize control. That kind of takes the aspect of him needing a woman to perform a sexual act on, because it's not so much about the sexual act, it's about the control. So the subject sometimes doesn't really matter to him. It's just a matter that he can control them. And like most serial killers, and I've talked about this numerous times before, and actually it's in a book that'll be coming out in 2024, serial killers fumble around in the dark, trying to figure out who they are. We see serial killers lighting fires. You see them torturing animals. You see them doing a number of different things because they're trying to discover who they are. Once they become who they are, which takes sometimes 4 years, that's why most pedophiles, I find it very interesting.
Call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
Most profilers always come in, and you hear this all the time. Well, the killer must be between the age of 31 and 38. He must be 61. He must be Caucasian. This is the old formula, and it was based on ignorance. The reason we used that number of 31 to 38 was because usually men at that time are already mature enough to know what they're doing and to discover who they are. They just plugged that old adage into this particular situation. The truth of the matter is, serial killers sometimes by 18 know exactly who they are. Jeffrey Dahmer is a very good example of that. Other killers take time to develop. BTK is another example of that. But sometimes serial killers are just not caught. You got to be very darn incompetent, or pretty darn incompetent, to get caught the first time you do something. Serial killers do it for a number of years, so if law enforcement picks up on them, and then the media names them. Once the media names them, the public recognizes who they are.
Interesting. So one of the things that I actually really find intriguing about that, now obviously there's a variety. So Jeffrey Dahmer first killed when he was 18. A lot of these guys maybe start in their 20s, in their late 20s, some of them, like say a Brian Kohlberger, although there's always the chance that they've killed before, that they just were not caught. But what are some insights that you might have about the process of development, the stages they may go to? Now, some of them may go through it more quickly than others, and some of them may have some reasons that they take longer. Do you have any insights into that, or anything that you learned from the people you've talked to?
Well, yes. Actually, that's very interesting you asked that question, because, I spent a number of years interviewing, without his knowledge, of course, William Bonney, the freeway killer. And I was able to gain a lot of insight with who he was. He was a pedophile. He was obviously gay, but he always tried to inject himself into certain situations where he can gain a bit of control, and he realized very early on that he was, in fact, homosexual. From realizing that, he immediately wanted to victimize people. I asked him about that. I asked him specifically as to why he found it so important to immediately rape. At first, he told me it was because he was molested. and he felt a lot of anger towards her. That was a smokescreen. Because what I've been able to do that other profilers or serial killer hunters have not ever been able to do is to interview the same person decades later and ask them the same question and see what the answer is going to be. I have found that consistency in answers several years later is a good way of telling you the person telling you the truth. Because remember, serial killers are always interviewed by law enforcement after they get caught. And they understand that they have all the power. They're not going to give any information about their reasoning, their traits, or what makes them tick.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
Okay. They may give up where the bodies are at. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll call right back then. Okay. All right.
Kill on April 10th, 1984 was particularly horrific. At a San Francisco apartment building, he lured a 9-year-old Asian girl into the basement where he beat, strangled, and raped her before stabbing her to death with a switchblade. He left her partially nude body hanging on a pipe by her blouse. Ramirez may actually have had an accomplice for this murder. The Night Stalker wasn't linked to the crime until 2009 when his DNA was matched to the crime scene, and police actually found the DNA of another person, an unidentified suspect, who has not been charged due to the lack of evidence and who was a juvenile at the time. The Night Stalker's next kill was on June 28th, and very different. Breaking into a home through an open window, he slashed a 79-year-old Los Angeles woman while she slept, nearly decapitating her. He proceeded to burglarize in order to support what had become a big drug addiction. 9 months later, he shot a 22-year-old woman inside a garage. The woman played dead and survived. Inside the home, Ramirez then shot and killed her 34-year-old roommate. Within an hour of that, he shot and killed a 30-year-old woman as she was getting out of her car. His murders seemed to be the work of an impulsive and disorganized mind. While this evidence he may have been a pedophile, his victims didn't fit any particular mold and ranged from children to the elderly, male and female. It's hard to tell if he spent a long time stalking his victims. Presumably he did, given the way he was mentored by his cousin and stepbrother. It seems like his drug-addled mind made him act without plan or method. The Night Stalker was a monster that had little control over himself. After Ramirez killed 3 people on March 17th in 1985, the one where he killed 2 women and severely wounded a third, his work began to generate the headlines, and he followed them closely. A week later, his killing took a much darker turn. He entered a home he had robbed a year before, shot the sleeping 64-year-old husband in the head, and tortured his 44-year-old wife. He bound her hands and beat her, demanding to know where the valuables were. While he was looking for them, she escaped, retrieved a shotgun from under the bed, and surprised him. But when she pulled the trigger, to her shock, the weapon was not loaded. In a rage, Ramirez killed her with 3 handgun shots. He attempted to have sex with the corpse, but still stunned with her pulling the shotgun, he couldn't perform. He then carved an inverted cross onto her chest and removed her eyes, placing them in a jewelry box. He would keep that box and the eyes in his apartment until his arrest. Bill Noguera reveals in these interviews the Night Stalker's obsession with removing eyes. In May, he entered a home and shot the elderly and disabled husband, then bound and raped the 56-year-old wife. But he did not kill that woman. 2 weeks later, he bound, raped, and tortured 2 women in their 80s. One would later die of her injuries. Ramirez drew a satanic pentagon on her thigh and on the walls. With his spree accelerating, the next day he entered the home of a 42-year-old woman and her 11-year-old son. He locked the boy in the closet and raped the mother, repeatedly telling her not to look at him or he'd cut her eyes out. Was this because he didn't want to be identified? Well, that doesn't seem to be the likely reason, as he left the mother and the child, witnesses to his crimes, bound together and alive. Serial killers like Ramirez are generally not capable of feeling remorse, but it might be that he saw a mother's judgment in those eyes. Maybe this is why he allowed them to live. The next night, he killed a 75-year-old woman by repeatedly stabbing her. So perhaps in the previous killing, it was the presence of the child that prevented him from killing the mother. A few nights later, he entered a home and bashed a 16-year-old girl on the head with a tire iron. When he couldn't find a knife to finish her off, he tried to strangle her with a live electric cord. And when he saw sparks coming out of the cord and the girl reviving, he thought Jesus had intervened, so he fled. The girl survived. He next killed a 60-year-old woman, and later that same night, he entered the home of another elderly woman, tried to rape her, robbed her jewelry, but let her live if she agreed to swear to Satan. 2 weeks later, he burst into the home of another elderly couple, attacked them with a machete, then finished them off with a .22. He quickly fenced the items he stole, and then that same night attacked another home. He attacked a 32-year-old male, bound the 8-year-old son, and raped the child's mother. Again, he made the woman swear to Satan. Did the presence of the boy cause him to leave that mother alive too? A couple of weeks later, he broke into a young couple's home and shot the woman in the face, then shot the man in the neck, and attempted to flee when the man fought back. Both victims actually survived. 2 nights later, at 2:30 a.m., he invaded another home and, finding a young couple in bed, shot the man in the face, killing him. He then handcuffed the 27-year-old wife and beat her, forcing her to reveal the locations of the family jewelry. Then he raped her and forced her to swear to Satan. Then something happened which took the nightmare to another level. The couple's 3-year-old son entered the bedroom. The Night Stalker tied up the boy and continued to rape the mother. When finished, Ramirez again left the mother and child alive. These crimes were all heavily covered in the California media, and the Night Stalker reveled in it, but also worried about being recognized. His next stop was in San Francisco, where he entered the home of an elderly couple, shooting the sleeping husband, then beating and sexually assaulting the wife before shooting her dead. He scrawled "Jack the Knife" on the wall in lipstick. Back in LA, a few days later, he broke into the home of another young couple, shot the man, and forced the woman to swear to Satan as he bound her with neckties and beat and raped her.
All right, I want to talk about Richard Ramirez's drug use. Obviously, you're aware from research the drug problems that he started at an early age using marijuana. I think when he was like 10 years old, and then I don't know how was that able to continue in prison, his drug use. Have you developed any insights from his addiction problems?
Yeah, I think in that case, look, he had a bit of a problem. And I say a bit because I've met a lot of people that are a lot worse than him when it comes to using drugs, and they didn't turn into serial killers. Right. So that he started using marijuana at 5, 10, 15 years of age, really, I believe, has no bearing on his prognosis as a serial killer. Now, while he was in prison, did he use drugs? Absolutely. How do I know this? Well, as I said, I always say this, I'm intimate with every person on the prison yard on death row. And what I mean by that is I'm intimate with their habits. And my life depends on it. I have to know exactly what every person on that yard does normally every day. So if something's going to happen, I can check and read all the different people, what they're doing. If they're not doing what they're supposed to do, it gives me a bit of insight into who may be involved. I did that with Richard Ramirez and every serial killer there. I learned their habits, what they liked, what they did, who they spoke to. Richard Ramirez is no different. Yes, he used, at a time, methamphetamines. They call it meth, crank, speed, whatever you want to call it. But it wasn't so much of a problem that he was chasing, where he was giving up everything, his television, etc. He liked to get high. But that had nothing to do with him as a serial killer.
Right, but obviously one of the problems with psychopaths, in particular type 2 psychopaths, is that they are more prone to addiction, and they do need that kind of high that they're lacking because they're normally low in dopamine. So this would be consistent with him being a psychopath, right?
It's consistent, but not necessary. So you mentioned L-dopamine. So most athletes experience what's called the athletic high. That happens because a person's brain releases L-dopamine, known as L-dopa, and it's what gives you the adrenaline rush. With serial killers or other killers, they get that rush. So when they're not feeling the rush, something like methamphetamines, cocaine, and other drugs can give you that type of rush. It's small. The act of raping while he's killing, that rush is 100 times more powerful than cocaine, methamphetamines, or any type of barbiturate that they can take that gives them a bit of that same rush.
Let's go back to just some of his crimes, because I know that he probably didn't discuss these directly with you. I know a lot of the other killers that we'll meet in our discussions did, but you scared the crap out of Ramirez, so he probably did not. But he may have discussed it with other people that you talked to. So his first crime, I think this is the one you were referring to, was a 9-year-old girl, Maya Lung, and this was in the basement of an apartment building. She was with her 8-year-old brother and looking for a lost $1 bill when Ramirez approached the girl and told her to follow him into the basement. And it was once they were in the basement that he beat, strangled, and raped her and then stabbed her to death. And he also hanged her partially nude body from a pipe by her house. So did he talk about this with anybody there that you're aware of?
The thing about Richard Ramirez is, yes, the thing about Richard Ramirez and my relationship or lack of relationship with him was based that, yes, I did scare the crap out of him. And I was able to observe him. I spoke to a number of people.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded,
including other serial killers. But he and I did not sit down and discuss things as I was able to with other serial killers. So I don't have an insight into how he did things, but I know one thing. He used to joke about the victims in his cases, specifically that child that he or his first victims. No remorse. He joked about it. Nothing. If you look at some of the interviews that he did over the years, he did those interviews with one goal in mind: to further his fame, to give himself more of a reputation. Richard Ramirez liked the fact that he got more mail than anybody on death row. He would get hundreds of pieces of mail from women around the world. He also got married on death row. And, we mentioned this before, that Richard Ramirez did not recognize me for years. When I basically beat the crap out of him, I didn't have a goatee or a Van Dyke. I just had a mustache, and I was a lot younger. When we ran across each other in the visiting room on death row, he had no idea who I was for several years. Until at that time, my wife asked me to shave my goatee, or Van Dyke, if you will, and I just had a mustache, and I was standing in the visiting line, and he looked at me, and suddenly he sucked in his breath. He recognized me. He fell backwards, fell over a bunch of chairs, and he scampered away like a cockroach. And then he told all the women in the visiting room that I had assaulted him. And my response was, really? I'm the bad guy here? So we didn't have that close of a relationship, but I did have a chance to study him closely, and I think you can get a lot from observing people for decades, just speaking to them, because you learn a lot from a person's actions.
Right. So women were allowed to visit him, and these were people that just developed a fascination with him and were able to come in and spend time with him.
Yes, but this is a room at San Quentin's death row. If you were a grade A inmate, meaning that you were considered not as violent as some of the guys, you were allowed, that means in prison, not what you do in the streets. He was allowed to get full contact visits with his female or male companions, and he had a lot of them come and see him.
Wow. So he's basically allowed like a conjugal visit kind of situation. And
he's not good. Yeah, he didn't get conjugal visits. He got a full contact visit, meaning you walk in. It's basically a cafeteria. You're able to walk in. You can hug your family member, kiss them. You can walk around holding hands. You can go buy things in the vending machine.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
It's basically an open room where people can just have a visit, and enjoy their family. Unfortunately, for most of the guys there, you had creeps like Richard Ramirez and a number of these serial killers that were in that visiting room as well.
So as we talked about, you've mentioned that the gratification that they generally get is from exercising this extreme form of control in a life and death situation that you have over another human being. And his first victim was this 9-year-old girl. His second victim was 79-year-old Jenny Vinco. So he went from a little kid to a very elderly woman. Is this typical, would you think?
Well, that's what makes them unique. We don't see Jeffrey Dahmer jumping from boys to older men. They have a specific case and a specific victim. Richard Ramirez, that's what makes him very unique. And I don't mean this in the sense to glorify what he did anyway. I do not. But for me, it's fascinating to see a mind work the way it is. He was not very intelligent. So that's another thing that the public should know. He was actually had below average intelligence. I'd say his IQ was about 90 or 91 at best. Not very intelligent, but his mind was already grasping what it was that he needed. And as I mentioned before, his sexual gratification was the most important thing to him. How he got it didn't matter, as long as he can exercise control, because for him, control heightened everything, and he could sexualize control.
So one of the things that I've seen too, and just even looking at the way dopamine works in the brain, is that for a lot of these guys, the largest release of dopamine they get actually is during the stalking phase of the killing. So they might, like you've talked about, I think you mentioned your theory in the Idaho murders, where the killer might have spent Richard Kohlberger time in a closet stalking them. So looking back at the Richard Ramirez case here, in the first kill with the little girl, do you think that was spontaneous and impulsive, or do you think there was a stalking aspect to it, or is it just hard to say at this point?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting question, because most organized killers stalk, watch the victim, like Kohlberger, and then act on it. Actually, fantasize about it. With Ramirez, there is no way he would know that those two children were looking for $1 in the basement at that time. So more than likely, he actually came upon them, and at that moment decided to do what he was going to do. It doesn't mean that he was not aware of her and hadn't seen her before and been watching her and saw them go in there and follow them into the basement or into that area of the apartment building. So it works both ways. And as I said before, these killers don't tell law enforcement reasoning, traits, or what really happened. You can basically calculate what happened by the person died, so obviously he went down there and he killed her, but you don't know what he was thinking. Serial killers never give that kind of stuff up unless you're a temper who loves to talk about everything, and he has an agenda as well. So these serial killers, when law enforcement interview them, they may admit to killing the person, they may tell them where the body's at, but they're not going to give up the most personal thing that they are involved with. Remember, to them, the act of killing is the most monumental act that they've ever done. It's very personal to them. It's very private. And although they share it with the public by calling the media or watching as law enforcement collect evidence, the real aspect of why they did it, their reasoning, their trace, is always kept secret unless you're able to get under their skin and figure out what happened by, well, look, we've talked about this, and I've said that, I'm the Jane Goodall of serial killers. I actually lived with them for 40 years. These serial killer experts that talk about serial killers read the case. They have no insight. They don't understand what makes these particular animals tick. How they will react with them.
Absolutely, and I can say to people, you're gonna experience this as we go forward in all of these interviews, because I've already spent many hours talking to Bill, and he definitely has insights that are different and consistent with what the theories that I have found on the general observations about psychopaths and the way their brains work. And so everything he has told me tends to ring true. But it also tends to be a different kind of insight that you would get from an FBI profiler who has the professional profiler the professional profiler is just getting what the serial killer wants him to know. But that's different than when you get to spend time in the cafeteria with someone and get him tell the story over and over again. You start to pick up some of the slight changes in each telling, so which can be revealing as to what really was going on in his mind. Okay, we're back with Bill Noguera. Bill, there's a lot of things I want to go into here. I want to start here, though. You've talked about the organized killer or serial killer. Tell us about the difference between the organized and the disorganized serial killer.
Okay. So this is a term that, John Douglas, the former FBI pioneer and profiler, came up with, and it rings true. You have organized serial killers who are those who stalk, fantasize. They're the guy that you see about in the movie. He drives around a car. He watches the victim before he strikes. A perfect example for something from recent memory is Brian Kohlberger. Brian, we all know that he went to that house 11 times, at least that's where his car is found in that area, and then on the 12th time he strikes. That is an organized killer. Now there's also the person who's driving down the highway. He sees a woman, he pulls her over, she's a hitchhiker, and the serial killer kills her. That is a disorganized. He's killing by chance. But in some cases, he knows he's going to find a hitchhiker, so he's driving around looking for that hitchhiker. So it's kind of a mixed bag of tricks. But usually the easiest way to distinguish the two is one, organized, he fantasizes, he stalks. The other one is a killer of opportunity.
So I want to know about Richard Ramirez and where he fits in. But a question I just have generally on that, too, is you and I have talked a lot about, you have a theory about serial killers are evolving. They're becoming a little bit more sophisticated over time, the ones that don't get caught. So is there an evolution does there tend to be an evolution from disorganized to organized? I know that it's more of a general type. Some tend to be, disorganized versus organized. But does someone that's disorganized become more organized over time?
Sure. It's about the MO. What that means is that the killer is able to organize his thoughts better. He becomes more proficient at killing. So the MO changes. Now the signature doesn't. And so let me explain the difference. The method of operation, if you want to call it, is how the killer kills, and that over time, like a lion or hyena, he perfects his manner of killing. And that's the MO. The signature is completely different. And a signature is, for layman's terms, so you understand what a signature is we've seen it happen when you see a basketball player come up to the free throw line, and before he shoots the basketball, he touches his hair, he touches his cheek, he dribbles the ball twice, he shakes his head, and then he throws the ball up in the air. Another example is baseball players. They come up to the plate, and before the first pitch, he unbuckles his gloves, he touches his hat, he raises his right leg, he swings the bat twice, and then he prepares to swing the bat. And then the ball's pitched. Even if the ball's not pitched, he goes through the same ritual. A signature is a ritual. It's something that he does not because it helps him kill, because it's something he thinks he has to do to kill. That's the difference between the method, MO, and his signature.
So looking at Richard, he first seems to act somewhat on impulse in killing the 9-year-old girl, but is it fair to say that killing was something that he had probably been fantasizing about ever since his adolescence, right?
Yes. Fantasizing of raping and killing. If we know his history, he worked at a motel at one point, and he attempted, when the family went out to do something, he came back, he was robbing the place, he attempted to rape a guy's wife, and they fired him. So that's him fumbling around the dark. He doesn't know what he is, but he's trying to figure it out. And rape is his first go-to move. And stealing. So he mixes both stealing and raping. And then, of course, it graduates. And we know that after that, he began to molest children. And these children were both boys and girls. That's him again trying to figure out who he is.
So then he kills, as we said, the 79-year-old girl. But that is a woman. Then the next thing, 9 months later, he killed a 22-year-old young woman outside her home by shooting her in the face, which is interesting, too, because he had seen his uncle shoot. The uncle shot his own girlfriend and killed her by shooting her in the face. Do you find that connection there? Yeah.
Sure. We can assume that he shot her in the face because the example of his uncle shooting his wife at the time in the face where he was sent to prison. However, remember, that is the symptom. How he killed her. It isn't the act of killing. He killed because he was going to kill no matter what. The way that he killed, of course, can be led to the inference that his uncle shot his wife the same way in front of Richard. So yeah, for example, that's a symptom.
In fact, I should say here, looking through this, this woman actually survived the attack, it looks like, because the bullet hit the keys that she held up.
Three-way call alert.
So that is correct.
Okay.
Okay. So what?
Now, you've mentioned that you believe that Richard was born to kill, and that maybe the circumstances in his life made sure he became that and enacted it. So was there any triggering moments? I'm interested in trigger. One thing I'm very interested in, Bill, is the idea of triggers. Is something that triggers someone to kill. And I don't mean to say that they were not going to be a killer and had no interest in it, and then something triggered them and switched them into something else. But maybe there was something that was preventing them or holding them back from enacting on their fantasies, and then something in their life triggers them. Do you have any thoughts about triggers?
Well, I don't know if so much triggers as them get to the point that they do it. Take a child who rides a bicycle. He doesn't immediately jump on the bicycle and try and jump over a car. He has to develop. There is a road that they have to go through. Certain things have to be met. It's like crawling, then walking, then running. With them, Richard Ramirez, it was stealing, raping, and then killing. So he had to crawl, walk, and then run. It's that simple. And people tend to overthink this. It really is about that. And I base that on interviews with several dozen psychopaths and serial killers over the past 4 decades. They all told me the same thing. And that's when you start developing a thesis, a pattern where the brain of a human works a certain way. And the brain of serial killers, they are human. They just have a different set of circumstances that makes them begin to go down a certain path. For Richard Ramirez, it was the act of burglarizing, stealing, then raping, and then killing.
Are there any general insights we can get from Richard Ramirez, or that you get from Richard Ramirez, that might help, that could be applied to other killers, whether unsolved cases or their comparable cases that you'd like to reference that might be similar?
Well, I also like to say that every killer is different. Every serial killer has different. Now, we can generalize them. We can find them in the categories. Richard Ramirez is very difficult to put in a category because of everything involved in his cases. He mixed motives: stealing, rape, control, sodomy, child molestation. He had so many layers to him. He was a true psychopath. And what I mean by psychopath and sociopath is that Richard Ramirez had no conscience, no empathy. He did not have any remorse. He thought that it was funny, that he glorified it, and it to get him more attention. Part of what Richard Mayhem only was the glorification of what he did, that the media followed him, gave him a great high. It made him feel very powerful. in his own little world, that's what got Richard Ramirez going. The more the media played into it, you notice, if you go back into 1984, 1985, and you see the newspaper, every radio station, every television program was showing the killings of Rick the Night Stalker. They didn't know who he was. This fed him. And as you can see, he began to kill faster and more, sometimes 2 a day, because it was feeding that dopamine he was chasing.
So do you think, now we've talked about some of the more fascinating conversations that we've had in private are about the evolving serial killers, but obviously not all of them. Do we see any signs with Richard, or is he just not intelligent enough? But do we see any signs that he evolved at all, or did he become more reckless as he believed his own myth?
Yeah, I think the latter. He became more reckless. And it was because he was only chasing that high, that rush of the kill. He, in no way, shape, or form, constitutes or represents what I consider where serial killers are evolving. He was purely instinctive. He killed out of impulse, he killed out of instinct, and that's it. Now, we have spoken about this, and I'm the first person who's talked about this, again, because of my insights. But there is an evolution.
This call and/or telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
Like any person, any society, serial killers are evolving. We have noticed in the past few years that we've had a couple of guys come forward, like the Gilgo Killer, the Golden State Killer, but those were decades old. There is a new breed of serial killers. While we think that serial killers are dying away, they are not. Serial killers are developing. They are evolving. They're becoming, and the evolving part isn't that they know so much about forensics, because every true crime channel and every podcast is about true crime, and these experts are talking about it, and people are learning. So, of course, the techniques, the gathering of evidence techniques, forensics, DNA. This is something very common in the conscience of America, or the conscience of the world. So serial killers know this. What serial killers normally can't do is control the impulse to kill. The new breed of serial killer, which I call a super serial killer, has the ability to control his impulse. Therefore, he does not need media attention. He doesn't need the victims to be found. And he also has learned that law enforcement usually catch these guys, not because they're great detectives or because they're doing great detective work, is because the serial killer made a mistake. That mistake, most of the time, is leaving DNA in a body, meaning it could be fluids, it could be hair, it could be touch fibers, it could be touch DNA. So what is the best way to avoid that? Well, this new breed of serial killer, he has a hunting ground, but he takes the victim. Then we have a victim who has disappeared, a missing person. But you won't find them because he kills them, he disposes the body, therefore no DNA, and he also has that ability to control the impulse to kill. So you won't see that reckless killing spree that goes faster and faster, like Richard Ramirez did, or the I-5 killer, or several killers that killed quickly and fast just to chase that high.
One of the so I'm listening to what you're saying here and forming a little bit of a theory myself. I want to hear what you think about this. So you've talked about how the serial killer goes through in the early stages, the kind of fumbling around in the dark to figure out who he is. All right. And I'm matching that up with what you're saying now. I'm matching that up with what you're saying now about how a serial killer is evolving in terms of, and the way he's evolving is he has better impulse control. And I'm wondering if he has that by having a better self-awareness now of what he is. So let's come back to that question in a moment. Can we do one more, Bill? And we were talking about my theory based on what Bill is talking about here. He's talking about how serial killers have evolved or are evolving. And the reason they're evolving is they have a better impulse control. And I'm wondering if this relates to having a better self-awareness just from even maybe some of the literature that they're reading about other serial killers and psychopathy itself. What do you think about that, Bill?
Well, I think you're partially correct. Yes, they have a better awareness of who they are. They hide their trail better. Instead of lighting fires and torturing animals when people find them, from very early on, if they torture the animals or if they're doing something destructive, because destroying is a very big part of serial killers. I've talked to several dozen of them, and they always refer as a victim as someone they destroyed. When they raped the person, when they killed them, they destroyed the life force. That was very important to them, and I saw this in a number of cases. So yes, if you have an individual that's developing quicker, he's more self-aware, he has better impulse control, then if he is killing animals, he's taking them somewhere where you can't find them. A lot of the earlier serial killers would put them on display to kind of show in marked territory, show who they are. Remember, they're very instinctive, and we're also animals by nature. I mean, we actually, not by nature, we are animals. The only difference between us and, say, a wolf is that we have the ability to reason. So you're right. These guys do have a better self-awareness. And I know always people have been asked, well, how do you catch this guy? Is this guy a super guy that you can't catch? You can't catch him. And the way to catch these killers is you'll have to, of course, there will be victims. You have to see the trail. Once you see the trail, you have to backtrack to their beginnings. The only way to catch these guys is to catch it in their beginnings. Because if you find out about them later on, you're not going to catch them. They're too clever. Let's take Kohlberger, for example. He was a PhD candidate. He was a teacher's aide in a criminologist class. He knew forensics. He knew all these things. But yet the thing that he had that he could not control was his impulse. He went to that house with the intent to kill. Things didn't go the way they wanted to. And I know about this case a lot, Kevin, because I was actually called in to talk about it. Because an FBI profiler and CIA profiler actually commented on what I was talking about with this case. He went there with not only the ability, but the intention to kill. Some things threw him for a loop. And when that happened, his instinct kicked in. He forgot about everything he knew about forensics, about touch DNA, and he allowed his impulses and his instinct to take over. That's what got him caught.
Right. It's interesting because one of the things that people, if you're a serial killer and if you're reasonably intelligent, there's some part of you that has to know that there's a very good chance that it's not going to end well for you personally, because most of the time these guys get caught. So you're going to end up on death row. But yet they still are in the grips of something that they just can't quite resist. But in an evolving serial killer, they may be able to control it just enough where they can delay gratification and be a little bit more disciplined in what they do. Is that what you're saying?
Sure. Let's think of it this way. We all know that if you drink and drive, there's a good chance you're going to get a ticket, pulled over, put in jail, or you're going to cause harm to someone else. But, that liquor, that high, that you're an alcoholic, it completely throws away your logic and you do it anyways. Same thing with drug use. You do it. You know it's going to lead to a bad life. You do methamphetamines, eat your teeth, your life goes to hell. You still do it. Serial killers in the same way. They're looking for that gratification.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
Once they're stimulated, they can't control it. They're chasing it. It's like a teenage kid who's a beautiful girl. You've got to chase her. Same thing. Kevin?
Yeah, I heard someone talking to you, so I was just going to make up. Are you talking to someone, Bill, or I didn't know what was going on in there? But
someone knocked on the door. I wanted to know what the hell it is. But I'm fine. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. It's interesting. So if you were, let's just say a serial killer was listening to this program, someone who is grappling with that impulse control just enough, what would be some suggestions that they might be, because they don't, just part of them, they know, just like a drug addict, like you said, it's a great example. It's a need that you have to satisfy but maybe some part of your mind knows that it's not going to end well for you personally, and it's self-destructive. So is there some possible way that they could, manage that control a little bit better?
Well, that's an interesting question, because the truth is that serial killers cannot be rehabilitated, just like rapists cannot be rehabilitated. They are going to do what they do no matter what, because nothing's important to them but their own gratification. And I know there's a lot of people that are going to think that you can rehabilitate a serial killer. Please listen to this. You cannot rehabilitate a serial perpetrator or predator. You cannot. And if there's a serial killer listening to this program, which I'm sure there is, and I'm sure he's smiling to himself thinking, I'm never going to get caught. There's no way what this guy's telling people is they going to catch me. Well, I beg to differ. No matter what I say, it's not going to stop a serial perp or serial predator from stopping from what he's going to do. So there's no advice. This isn't a child that I'm saying, look, don't use drugs. These are the effects of it. That does not cure a serial killer. All I can tell a serial killer, if he's listening, which I'm sure they are, is that you will get caught. And it's not going to go good for you in prison. Look, I'm doing this for a reason. You and I had a very long talk about this, Kevin, about why I do what I do. First of all, I'm good at it. But this is my way I pay my debt to society that I could never pay. Believe me, taking a human life is something you just can't pay back. But I'm going to do my damnedest to help bring finalizations to victims' family. It's why I'm contacted by several dozen families every year to try and look at cases, cold cases, so I can bring the case back to life and maybe give some insight about what that killer did and who he really is. So if you're a serial killer, and I'm looking at you, you're going to get caught. Because you can't hide from me.
That's right. That's right. And the only limitation, I hope that someday in the future we can develop a system, or they accept a system where we can build information a little bit more rapidly on these cases, because there's a process that you have to go through. And I understand the security situation that applies to that. But if we could get him information quicker, and I think we could probably save some lives and definitely lead to some resolutions. I wanted to mention to you too, Bill, I don't know if you've heard of this guy, but he's a criminologist called Peter Vronsky. And he has but one of his theories is that serial killers increase the generation after a large war was fought involving, say, the United States. And the reason is because the fathers come home and they tell stories in front of the children, with their war buddies and stuff, that are very graphic, involve graphic violence. And this hits the children as they're at that age where they're developing sexual ideas too. So when they're, 10, 11, 12 years old. Now, as you would rightly say, that's not going to just develop a normal person into a serial killer. But someone who's born with that kind of a brain, could that help start wiring that brain more in that direction at that age? Do you hold anything to that theory? Because it does look like Ramirez did have that here. His uncle coming back from Vietnam spent a lot of time talking about these horrific things that he had done in Vietnam.
Yeah, I've heard about this doctor's theories, and look, eating too many Twinkies on Saturdays when you're developing could contribute to. It's just not true, and I'll tell you why. These men that went to war, and again, I always honor our servicemen. They give us freedoms that we normally wouldn't have. That's what makes this country the best country in the world. So my respect to those servicemen and women. But that has nothing to do with serial killers, and I'll tell you why. If you go into Los Angeles or some of these areas where gang activity is at a height, you have hundreds of thousands of children exposed to gang violence where their fathers are gang members, and they are talking about killing the other gang member and all this glorification for the gang and everything. And the only thing that affects them is the kid joins a gang. They don't become serial killers. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a big difference between a person who kills somebody for a gang, because even if you kill 10 or 15 people, the logic is they're doing it for the gang. It's a war between another gang, and just like a war from, Russia and the United States or whatever, there is a numbing effect that they're doing it for the gang, so there's really no consciousness of what they're doing, because they're doing it for a bigger picture, which is that gang. Just like a serviceman will say, look, I'm fighting for the United States. He doesn't feel terrible about killing a German or a different person within the country. Again, it has zero to do with serial killers. These serial killers are not killing. These gang members are not killing and getting gratification out of it. Now, there has been a couple of cases where gang members are serial killers. There's one in Los Angeles, and I actually met the man. We'll speak about it in future episodes. But he was a gang member. He was killing other gang members, but on the side, he was raping and murdering women in his neighborhood. He killed 20-plus women. That's a whole different animal. War has nothing to do with serial killers. As much as I'd like to respect the doctor's opinion, he's absolutely incorrect.
Okay. All right, Bill, why don't we wrap it up here, since we've only got about 2 minutes left on this call.
This is the reason we're doing this, is to bring information, to educate the public, so they are not victim to these perpetrators or these predators. I always like to end my episodes, or when we're at a talk, with, be safe. Be aware of your surroundings, because your life can depend on it. It's what I always say, and it exactly means that. Always be aware of your surroundings. Watch. I'm not asking you to be paranoid because there's a serial killer around every corner, but you should always watch. Never leave yourself in a situation where you're alone. If your instincts are telling you you are afraid, pay attention to them. It could lead to you saving your own life.
Some general observations we can make about Richard Ramirez. Males had no sexual appeal for him, and he had no interest in torturing them. Men were just to be disposed of so he could get on with the looting of the homes and the raping and torturing of the women. His rape victims range from 9 years old to women in their 80s. The presence of a boy in the home seemed to make him more likely to let the mother live. We should note that he was high on drugs all the time, not as an excuse for what he did. The drugs didn't cause him to murder, but to understand that the various drug states could affect his changing MO in these crimes. Also noteworthy is how, in at least one case, he ordered the victim not to look at him while he raped her. Did this with the woman whose son was locked in the closet. So it's tempting to wonder about Richard's relationship with his own mother. Like, did he feel harsh judgment in the eyes of some of the victims if they reminded him of his mother? Bill discussed in the interview how Ramirez removed the eyes of the women in the porn magazines he used in prison. Serial killers are incapable of empathy or remorse. They bask in the notoriety of their media image, so they don't have a conscience in the usual sense. But there are elements of self-image that impact how and when they kill. It's very important to keep that in mind. Okay, thank you, everybody. Please hit subscribe and notify, and we'll see you in the next interview.